But so it's my pleasure now to introduce you to Jennifer LeMesurier from University of Washington. Welcome.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so I just want to start by saying thank you to Jaime and Eva and the other organizers of this conference. This is my presentation, Somatic Metaphors. Yes? It's not on? Closer? Yes. Thank you. All right, is that better? Yeah? Okay, so this is my presentation, Somatic Metaphors, How Moving Bodies Harvest Spatiotemporal Experience. And I think we might have a few minutes at the end today to talk and ask questions, but if not, my email's on the screen, and you're more than welcome to come up to me afterwards and ask me some questions. So let's start. So the body as described in the Metahumanist Manifesto is a frontier body, a body that is able to strategically navigate existing power relations and produce new articulations. Alongside conducting, quote, genealogies of bodies, movements, and affects for the purpose of both challenging existing regimes and producing new forms of resistance and emergence, I am arguing that part of the answer to the metahuman question can be found in excavating the existing knowledges that bodies store, recall, and motivate in everyday action, most notably in movement. If, as Catherine Hales says, the body is the original prosthesis that we learn to control, we need to better understand how we can access the embedded knowledge that results from the combination of biological medium, the body, and practice. And as so many of you have demonstrated this week, the intersection of the biological medium and technology in practice. So in other words, a greater measure of the body's intelligence will allow us to understand what situations are more and less sympathetic to the formation of metahuman bodies. I posit that bodies in motion hold the potential to create alternative and subversive frameworks and raise questions about normative standards. And you can see here I've highlighted part of the Metahuman Manifesto that I felt really called to my project in terms of emergence and movement. So by investigating systems of bodily training, such as dance pedagogy, we can better understand how to counter-discipline bodies in ways that achieve alternative modes of being. Human bodies are understood as constrained and shaped by the societal context in which they develop. Particularly, there's been much attention paid to how discursive constructions of the bodies and their accompanying knowledges are constraints on bodily formations and, accompanying knowledges. Perhaps most famously, the theorist Michel Foucault talks about how discourse limits what bodies are even possible. Noting the body is, quote, the inscribed surface of events, traced by language and dissolved by ideas. What I explore in this project is how the interpenetrating relationship between discourse and the body need not just be seen as an external to internal relationship. In other words, how is it possible to work within dominant discourses of bodies as resources for potentially subversive or alternative ends? I posit the answer to this question rests on the creation of kinesthetic awareness that allows us to access and wield habitually created embodied knowledge that is accessible through strategic remembrance, roughly embodied awareness and habits accessed through memory. Specifically, dance teachers use discursive strategies that are designed to enable awareness of embodied possibilities and access their embodied habitual knowledge for performative ends. Through the use of what I'm calling somatic metaphors, dance teachers aim at the productive use of memory. By using metaphors that place the dancer into a remembered mental, emotional, and/or affective state, the dancer is then able to also remember the accompanying physicality. Dance teachers use these metaphors to enable their students to harvest their past embodied experience for certain qualities and movements. These metaphors are affective, meaning they, quote, draw on visceral forces beneath, alongside, or generally other than conscious knowing, vital forces insisting beyond emotion that can serve to drive us towards movement, toward thought and extension. Movement is one way of accessing these visceral forces that are so hard to parse out through purely discursive means. I argue we can better understand the productivities of bodies if we explore discursive strategies as triggers for affective, emotional, and embodied experiences and knowledge. From the field of rhetoric, which is concerned with the crafting of strategic messages to create ideological and material change, the concept of kairos aids in understanding how this blend of kinesthetic awareness and habits can be productive. Originally used to refer to the famous scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus shoots an arrow through a line of axe heads. As you can see on the screen, sort of, there's a line of axe heads and he's getting ready to aim. Kairos refers to the right or opportune time to do something, or right measure in doing something. I argue that in order for bodies to be subversive and provide alternative pathways of living and worlding the world, as Aaron Manning says, bodies must be able to sense the kairotic moment, the opportunity, and act accordingly. This recognition of the opportune time, and also opportune embodiment, is only possible with training that instills dexterous habits, habits that can then be drawn upon in response to the particular vagaries of new situations. A kairotic opportunity is only recognizable as such if there is previous experience with similar enough situations and the accompanying memories of successful or not successful bodily actions. Additionally, the body must be consciously aware of the previous experience as a resource in order to deploy it as an effective response. Dance pedagogy is an example of a system of bodily training that instills alternative movement habits and raises awareness of the possible range of situations in which these habits could be used. So it's the idea of creating sort of a conscious, embodied storehouse of knowledge. I deem what I am calling somatic metaphors as crucial for understanding moving bodies because of their simultaneous partaking in the realm of discourse and the realm of bodies. The cognitive linguist George Lakoff argues that metaphors are, quote, conceptual in nature, frame-to-frame mappings across conceptual domains, and that linguistic metaphors are surface reflections of those conceptual mappings. In other words, these creative representations are our attempts to encapsulate at least part of an embodied experience in the discursive. Conceiving of metaphors as somatic means attending to how these images work as a discursive bridge between previous experience and the current demands on the body. So I don't have time to go through all of these, but from my observation work at the University of Washington in modern and ballet classes, here are a few examples of what I'm calling somatic metaphors. And it's the idea of the discourse invoking a certain quality. So for example, in the first one, lightning bolts in your elbows, the movement was a sort of circular, explosive movement with the arms. And in the context of a ballet class, the teacher was trying to get her students to not remain in sort of the quiet, balletic sort of aesthetic. And so she used this somatic metaphor to enable this new way of moving. In another example, taken from a ballet class at the University of Washington, the teacher uses a somatic metaphor to enable her students to find a greater quality of lift in the upper body during pliés. So during pliés are where you bend your knees, and I can't do it in a skirt, but you bend your knees until your butt almost touches your heels. And in order to do this successfully, you need to lift your upper body up and away so that you don't just fall over. So Patricia notes this idea is going to be different for everyone. She then talks about having an eye on your chest and gently rotating the eye so that it faces the ceiling. She also talks about having a balloon on your chest and feeling that balloon float upwards. Here, Patricia is encouraging the student to find a certain quality of lift in her upper body. It is not about a rough picking up of the torso and hoisting it upwards, but about finding a soft, light way of moving. The image she provides of a balloon lifting upwards is designed to invoke a state of remembrance in the dancer, and further invoke a transference of that remembered experience to the dancer's current movement. The first step in the metaphor acting as a bridge between discursive description and embodied experience is recall. By describing an image as a goal for one's movement quality, the teacher is asking the student to remember all of her past experiences with that image, and then externalize them through a physical re-performance in the present. So in the case of the balloon floating upwards, the student is being asked to remember instances in her past of releasing a balloon so it can rise up, feeling the insistent but light tug of the balloon on its attached string, and the necessary reaction in the rest of the body in response to the balloon's lift. All of those linked memories carry with them a physical referent based in one's physical experience. The student asked to feel the balloon tied to her chest is being asked to inhabit a physical state based in one's past experience via the imaginary, translating those remembered feelings into a light, floating, qualitative embodiment. This is a simple metaphor and a simple movement. The seeming childishness of a balloon-based metaphor demonstrates how these metaphors are able to cross time and reactivate perhaps long-dormant embodied experience as a basis for new movement possibilities. As theorist Aaron Manning states, bodies and movements space-time and time-space rather than existing in an empty container of space marked by the passing of a linear timeline. Space and time are not separate from the body, but exist as conditions of bodily movements. The use of somatic metaphors to recall experience in the service of contemporary and future performances is an instance of bodies defining time. Instead of remaining constrained by present circumstances, the dancers are being taught to embody a layered sense of time where the past and present coexist in the moment of performance. In each performance of the related movement, the dancer is then creating yet another version, another permutation, remembering the previous experiences even as he or she adds to the depth of knowledge surrounding that movement. Once the dancer has a high enough level of awareness and stored habits of movement, she can then use her movement strategically, kairotically, in response to the pressures of various situations. In a modern class at the University of Washington, George, a modern dance teacher, uses a somatic metaphor that compares different parts of the body to engender this increased level of kinesthetic awareness. So he reminds his students of how he likes an extended tendu. So tendu is where you stretch your foot forward on the floor and you point through the foot. It's designed to stretch and strengthen the foot. And he likes an extended tendu, which means it's a little bit off the floor. Hello, heels. He tells them he wants them to wiggle their toes a little and relax their feet. As he talks about this, he raises his arm and gently wiggles the fingers as he wiggles the toes. He wants them to think of picking something off of a tree, like you would pick a cherry, and you don't want to squash the cherry. And then he mimes squashing a cherry with his thumb and forefinger. With this metaphor, George is aiming at enabling his students to find a delicacy of movement in their feet. This metaphoric comparison is an attempt to transfer the greater amount of experience with performing a delicate quality that one might have with hands versus the feet. So even experience not performed by the body part in question can be used as a resource for current and future performance demands. The discursive bridge, the metaphor, allows him to directly point to students' past experience with squashing cherries, while also creating an intra-body connection between the hands and feet. This intra-body connection, this parallel between the actions of the feet and hands, can also be the basis for new bodily habits. Through this metaphoric emphasis on delicacy, George is also revising the habits of his students and how they perform tendus. Tendus are both a warm-up exercise and a basis for many larger movements, such as kicks and jumps, meaning that this seemingly isolated idea of how to perform one movement holds ramifications for the entirety of the dance student's experience. George's students are creating habitual knowledge via repetition. This new knowledge is then part of the body every time it moves through a similar pathway. So creating productive embodied change is about continual, ritualized embodied practice that creates certain bodily habits in a larger system of increasing kinesthetic awareness. The power of metaphors to invoke these histories and changes in bodies should inspire caution when considering what metaphors are used. Just as metaphors can evoke new ways of moving, they can also serve to solidify dominant ideologies within one's movement habits. In an interview about her approach to taking dance class, Jane, a graduate student at the University of Washington, discussed some metaphors that she found useful for helping her think about activating her core muscles and dropping her ribs. So in dance, a very strong center is very important, because if you're out of alignment, it's hard to move your body in unison and therefore very efficiently. So she says, the one that I liked a lot was the image of two pieces of elastic, one of them going horizontally and vertically, from kind of like your pubic bone to your sternum or something. And then I've heard other people have used the corset metaphor, which of course is a little bit oppressive in terms of being a woman, being in dance, thinking about body image and the like. So I appreciated the elastic thing because it avoided that oppressive metaphor, but it was very effective. And it had like some movement to it, this idea of elasticity, so I like that one. Jane insightfully points out not only how different metaphors are wrought with different ideologies, but also how those original ideologies can produce different affective and embodied effects. Later in the interview, she states, I think sometimes for some people, a certain metaphor will never work. And other people are like, oh, that's amazing, I'm so glad you said that. And I just think that's interesting that there's a real individuality to what works. So part of what determines this connection with a metaphor is how one has become both mentally and physically habituated in certain ideological contexts. In other words, if metaphors operate by engaging the individual in a process of embodied recall, metaphoric engagement is a process of engaging with not just the associated physicality, but also the ideological context that produce that type of body and movement. Jane is obviously aware of the ideological context in which women wore corsets, and as a result, moved in certain ways, or perhaps it'd be more accurate to say didn't move in certain ways. Her conjoined physical and mental awareness of the material conditions that historically surrounded corset wearing leads her to reject that metaphor in favor of the idea of elastic between the ribs and pelvis. Specifically, she appreciates the presence of movement in the elastic metaphor that is lacking in the corset one. She has developed a high enough level of both kinesthetic and ideological savvy to be selective in what metaphors impact her movement habits. So I would ask us to begin raising our level of kinesthetic awareness by considering what embodied habits we regularly perform, whether or not you're a dancer. We all contain multiple strands of the past, determined through the intersection of our of our interesting bodily configuration and external situations. And we can call up these strands as resources to help us strategically navigate demands. Perhaps theorist Pierre Bourdieu's most famous quote about the body is that the body believes what it plays at. It weeps if it mimes grief. What I wish to emphasize is that this famed ability is only possible if the body has been trained through habitual experience in weeping. It is through the intersection of societally acceptable understandings and personalized rituals of crying, put into action through repeat performances, that the body learns what weeping is. Once it contains a store of weeping-related experiences, only then is it able to recall the associated emotional state when we're placed into that same bodily posture. Yet without awareness of how this regulated improvisation continually operates, we are unable to access both the power and knowledge within normative ways of moving, even found within crying, and use them elsewhere. Using somatic metaphors in a highly body-focused training system such as dance roughly enables the ability to embodiedly improvise in ways that are not part of habitual ways of moving. Part of what enables this productive improvisation is attention to the individual and the situational. As theorist Catherine Hales points out, postures are generalizable to some extent, but their enactments also depend on the specifics of the embodied individual. The precise length of limbs and torso, the exact musculatures connecting tendon and joint, the sedimented history of body experience shaping the muscle tension and strength. Each enactment of a habitual practice is a chance for inventional alternatives based on the particularities of that individual's anatomy and ideological shaping, as well as the surrounding situational context. But there are very few places or times in everyday life where we have the opportunity to recognize this bodily power. If we want to understand how to create and how to use bodies that burst out of dominant systems of labels and practice, we need to better understand the knowledges that bodies possess and how to make this conscious and explicit. We need to understand this embodied cognition and what it can do differently from other forms of cognition. Because our ways of responding and existing in situations are often so normalized, it is often difficult to see alternative pathways for moving and being. However, I argue that the example of interaction between discourse and bodies within dance instruction forces us to reconsider the productivities of bodies as potential knowledge sources. The body's ability to flicker between temporalities, to reconfigure stored memories into contemporary resources, means that our accrued embodied habits are not just oppressive forces, but also possible means of charting new ways of being, even within dominant societal systems. The body is not just a mostly full storage facility with knowledge partitioned into boxes for easy removal or recombination. Rather, the body becomes the weight of its experience and becomes inseparable from the knowledge these experiences have produced. This performative identification is why bodies are able to use knowledge strategically in different situations. I would also pose the consideration of what metaphors are being motivated towards and around us. In order to understand where metahuman bodies have room to create change via movement, we also need to understand the metaphors that are commonly used around bodies now, and how those metaphors are already constraining our behavior through invoking certain embodied responses. And I would also add, I would say, a very productive thing to consider for those of us who are interested in the metahuman, right? What sort of metaphors are we creating to describe this new metahuman body? And what sort of embodied actions and knowledges are those metaphors drawing upon? A greater understanding of how bodies are already constrained and already enabled will help us understand where we need to develop more dexterous, mobile, kairotic ways of moving and existing. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. We can open now some time for dialogue, whatever, questions, comments. I don't know if any of you wants to start with that. There's so much noise. Okay, now it's fine. Well, I find a very deep connection with things we've been working in the workshop last week, since we actually would like to develop kinds of meta-methodologies for understanding precisely how bodies are aligned in specific kinds of problematic choreographies from, well, in all scales and modes of our realities, and how we may disalign from them into fields of potential, as you were suggesting. And with regard to the metahumanist proposal that Stefan Sorgen and myself did some years ago. And so I think it's very interesting how you approach this from the notion of somatic metaphors. I couldn't help like linking it to this other metaphoric approach of well, Mark Johnson, which goes perhaps like, it's not like the other way around, but it's in a way like how thinking is embodied as a metaphor. So both things are, I think, intensely connected in a way. And when I think of those, I also can't help linking it to Derrida's difference and dissemination as ways of trying to understand how is it that somatic metaphors or embodied reasons are always differing and always emerging because of that, and linking it to Hales again. So I see the connections all over the place. So this specificity of not only a body, but an embodiment of the actual embodiments and the circumstances and the histories. So yeah, well, I think, great.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So I just arrived in Madrid today, so I did not see any of the other presentations. So I'm sorry if this comment may seem naive or something. But so I'm coming at this from I could even say the opposite perspective, from architecture as opposed to performance. And from this perspective, I'm confronted with the discourse of architects who are trying to engage with this kind of anestheticization of space that your dance pedagogy seems to seek to address and seek to subvert. But I just kind of want to express, I don't know, I guess it's a personal doubt, because I've recently come much more into contact with performance art, and that seeks to subvert architecture in very explicit ways. But my doubt is regarding the potential for reification that the subversion actually has. Because my fear is that when we embody subversion in just our body disintegrates, our body decomposes, and we also, it may be based on memory, but we also forget. So I don't, it's just kind of a comment, there's no real question, but I really thought that your presentation was really quite powerful for bringing that inner conflict up again inside me. So thank you.
Thank you. So you said you were an architect? Okay.
Okay, well, I'll stand. Yes, to all of that, you asked a lot, or you just commented on a lot of things. Yes, I would agree that the potential for reification in performance is always present, right? Especially when you're talking about something that has anything to do with art, where you have the sort of continual aesthetic demands there. What I would say, just sort of off the top of my head, and I, not to indicate that's superficial at all, because I really believe this, I think that that the point of how our bodies are trained is really, really important. And I think in coming at it from an architecture standpoint, we were just talking about this, how does architecture train our bodies, right, to pass through spaces in a certain way? And I think just coming at it from that question is itself subversive, right? Because to some extent, well, I mean, like in Seattle, where I'm from, the Seattle Public Library, I don't know if you know it, the bathrooms are painted this horrific puke-colored eye-searing green, and that was a very deliberate choice, and there was discussion about this in public forums because they didn't want homeless people staying in the bathrooms. And that was a very clear case of how they were manipulating the space to control, to discipline, to shut people out. So I think just approaching architecture and those sort of design questions from the opposite way of like, how could we use architecture to help train bodies in subversive ways? I mean, I think just even starting that question is super important. But I thought your comment about how bodies decompose and bodies decay and bodies forget is also super important to remember. That's something that's sometimes as a dancer I have to pull back and be like, wait, bodies are not superhuman, yes, although they can look it.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm really interested in this, in the role of the metaphor. It's sort of a brief question, really. I just wondered, what does the metaphor do? What happens to the metaphor when it is embodied? Does the metaphor remain the same? So we've got the problematic metaphor of the corset, but is there an opportunity for the body to sort of change what that metaphor means? Because if we think, you start off with a position where the corset is a imposing sort of control of the body, but then if we think of the corset through the body as a way of sort of molding our body through dance, does the metaphor change? Because our memory of it next time is not so much tied with its previous meaning, but with our experience of it in a different context. I just wondered if the metaphor, so our bodies are malleable, but are the metaphors malleable as well? I just wondered if that's a boring question or...
Can you all hear me?
It's for this recording, it's messages.
All right. Okay, well that's an interesting question. Yes, I mean, I don't want to say, because I don't want to sort of concretize the metaphors themselves. I just found that example super compelling, right? And I definitely think there are examples I have metaphors where they're sort of removed from their original context and put into practice in certain ways. I think I was poking more at sort of an unproblematized, sort of just brute, crude, you're wearing a corset, suck in your stomach sort of thing. For example, I teach dance, and one of the metaphors that I use is the idea of a meat hook, which, you know, there's some ideology there in terms of neoliberal capitalism and all that. But the idea is that the meat hook goes in under your ribs, and it's right there next to your heart, and so you have to be very lifted and very pulled up. But when I talk about it to my students, I do a lot of reframing, right? It's not the idea that you're just, you know, you're a piece of meat hanging from a hook. The idea is really that you are very aware of your movement on an internal level, in a way that I think that some of the just external metaphors, like just the corset or just you have a rubber band around your waist, don't get at, but really feeling the internal to external there. So long answer to your question, but yes, I do think the metaphors can be malleable as well, but I do think because of their power, I do think it takes some reframing as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. You keep me thinking in a very, very weird way. So I remind the Aquinas theory of virtue, that is a habit linked to the body, and particularly to movement. And he put examples. So, sorry. Metaphors are particular examples in a way that you embody it. And it's very clear, and you feel the metaphor and you embody it. This is very clear. The issue this drives you to particular movements. So it is a way of feeling the whole body in relation to this metaphor, but it's this metaphor. And habits are linked to virtue, as social movements are linked to virtue and habits. So clearly, if we perform in other ways that the expected, probably we will find a bad reaction to them. But wouldn't come from these metaphors in order to unbuild the expected metaphors, so to say, an ethic, and a specific one? I mean, is not that a bit fixed? Does it make sense? Okay. In order to unbuild a concept of virtue through moments and metaphors, if we build new metaphors, as metaphors are particulars and fixed, are not we building a new choreography with a new ethics, but I mean a specific one? This is what is my concern. The flexibility of the ethics of a moment based on metaphors.
Thank you. See, so building a new ethics, sort of to go along with the metahuman idea, and sort of how much are we just sort of like rejecting an old system and building a new one, sort of thing. Yeah, I think this is where I really reveal that I'm still a structuralist, and for me it's less about. I think it is a matter of perspective in terms of like not building a metahuman, excuse me, alongside or in a separate spot from the sort of discursive or ideological structures that we're in now, but sort of how can we weave the metahumanness into what we do within these dominant structures? Let's see, I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, so in terms of being a woman, in terms of body image, right? And there's a lot of metaphors around how you're supposed to sit, how you're supposed to stand, and those are put forth in metaphors, right? And images, some stronger than others. And I haven't started doing this, and I think I might actually have to, which means I'll have to explain this to everyone. But so for example, going back to Iris Marion Young, who talks about, throwing like a girl, right? And how you're supposed to sit as a woman. So I think one thing that you could do one thing that I could do that would be a small example of subverting the larger structures but not building new ones, not necessarily trying to tear it down, would be to sit in a skirt like a man does, but not be ashamed, not be overtly aggressive about it, but just sort of find new habits for myself as a woman, sitting in this way. And I think if you find those small movements, those small ways of being in your body, I think that's really where I find metaphors really powerful. And I think for me that's why I focus on the individual, because I think if you focus on the individual, you can productively avoid the idea of building a new ethics or building a new sort of choreography, as you were saying.